So let us have a look a little more at our amazing organ, our onboard computer, our brain, which regulates everything. So as we've said, the stress and the uncertainty creates responses which are really not healthy for us. So what we need to do is find strategies to detect those through self-awareness, openness to learning, and then do something about them. So let's understand a little bit about what happens in the brain. So it is so vital that we get control over this onboard computer of ours in order to be able to mitigate and control the effects of uncertainty and then stress on our lives and our bodies. So our bodies and brains will respond with hormones, electrical impulses, all sorts of things in order to combat this threat, because threat and fear is the stimulus for us to go into survival mode. We are survival beings and we are patterning machines. And it is a natural inbuilt response mechanism that we are survival beings. So what you need to do is you need to detect your own individual patterns in relation to survival, because we all will have different ones. However, there are commonalities in terms of our brain. We all have a brain. We all have two hemispheres. Now, those two hemispheres has got a lot of detail and content within it. Now, you don't need to become a neuroscientist or a neuropsychologist, but it does help to understand some of the basic principles, just so you understand what actually certain strategies such as writing can help you to really regulate this amazing organ of ours, our onboard computer. It's like when you're sitting with your actual computer, if you happen to be a coder or understand coding, it's complex. You need to get into the mechanisms of the brain, of the computer. Here, we can do that with ours too. So the limbic system is so core to our self-regulation, and understanding a little bit about the limbic system will give you so much, hopefully, motivation to really employ strategies, but with intent on a regular basis, because you will understand why it's so important. The limbic system sits nestled right in the center of the brain. It controls our physiological responses, it controls our emotional responses. So I'm talking in a simplistic sense. There's obviously a huge amount of detail behind this. But in the limbic system, we have got various functions which control us. So let us first of all look at the whole brain and its development, because it's actually really interesting to look at how it develops in order to understand how powerful emotions are and how much they influence us in everyday life. So as the brain develops, we develop in effect from the bottom up. Let us look at the brain development during one person's lifetime and then look at the interesting relationship with that in relation to the evolutionary scale. Because we actually develop the brain stem first. It develops in the womb. Now, the brain stem is to do with arousal, sleep, waking, hunger, satiation, breathing, and the chemical balance in our brain. And it is highly responsive to threat. It's the first thing that it develops. The limbic system, some people call it the limbic brain because they use the triune brain as an explanation that we have three parts of the brain. Some people think that's simplistic. Sometimes simplistic is good, but it's not the whole story. Let's just remember that. But the triune brain idea is that the limbic brain, the fact that it's got its own label shows how important it is. That is to do with the map of a relation between the organism and the surroundings. So the limbic system maps yourself to its surroundings. It is to do with emotional relevance, to do with categorization, perception. And this, very interestingly, is organized mainly during the first 6 years of life. Now, isn't that fascinating? The same pattern as the evolutionary scale. The part of our brain that develops last is actually the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is to do with planning, anticipation, sense of time and content, inhibition of inappropriate actions. And it's also to do with empathic understanding. So empathy, the logic of empathy is processed here. And this develops last. And it's very affected by trauma as well and stress. And it also is very vulnerable to go offline in response to threat. So this developed last, it's affected by trauma, and the effects of trauma means that it then develops an inability to filter out irrelevant information. And it's vulnerable to go offline in response to threat. So what that means is when there is a threat response coming in, that actually it won't process anything. It can go offline, it will shut down. It's called the shutdown effect. So the logical response mechanisms to threat shut down. And this is what we find in relation to stress, that actually the limbic system and the emotional responses take over. So one other thing I'd like you to understand is the way in which the brain takes in information and then processes it. So 2020 is such a big year of change. And this change and uncertainty brings around stress, brings about fear responses and threat. And our brain does not deal well with uncertainty or stress. And this is the key point. We have got to be aware of our fear zones and our fear responses. And your fear zones and fear responses will be different to mine. We all have individually different experiences and patterns that have developed over the years based on what we've been through in our lives that then create our response mechanisms towards certain stimuli. So we need to be aware of our fear zones and fear responses, and then we need to be aware of how we can change these fear zones into safety zones. So there are internal fear zones, there are external fear zones, there's internal safety zones, and there's external safety zones. And what I mean by that is internally, you will have certain patterns, certain things, certain programming that is established and laid down, which then means that if a certain stimulus comes into your senses, if you see something, smell something, hear something, it'll trigger that, and then your limbic system and the rest of your brain will send signals to the rest of your body, which then creates a stress response. But that is unique to you because that is an internal patterning to you as an individual, and I will have different ones. So what we need to do is we need to be able to consciously register these internal patterns that create certain responses and then do something about it, almost have a watchdog, a watchtower over it, so that we can actually then respond accordingly. So it needs to have a conscious intervention between stimulus and response. We may need to make the gap between stimulus and response bigger. We can do this. There are ways we can do this. Writing is one of them. Writing is an amazingly beautiful, wonderful act that can help us to increase the time between stimulus and response because it gives us time to reflect. And we are trying to change this fear response into a safety response. Now, that will take some doing, especially if it's a hardwired stimulus that is ingrained in you for whatever reason. So the key thing to understand about us human beings is that we are patterning machines. Our brain seeks patterns and then establishes patterns. So unless we are aware of these patterns, they will take hold. So what we need to do, our job is to be in control of our onboard computer. We need to be in control of it rather than it being in control of us. And when we are stressed and when there is uncertainty, it is far more likely that the patterns will overwhelm us. And this is where our mental health and our well-being can really be challenged unless we are consciously aware of what's going on inside us and we can control it. Because you and I can control our onboard computer if we know how. And if you understand just a little bit about the psychology and physiology, I really do believe it will help you to take that essential control, because you can in effect understand how you're trying to rebuild and rework what's going on inside you. You're taking control over your own biology. We know it works. So the key thing is that learning rests upon a foundation of feeling safe. So psychological safety is really important to be an effective learner, to be an effective decision maker, to be an effective thinker, to be an effective communicator. So if I'm worried about something happening right now, it will disturb my train of thought and I will go, I will stop talking fluently. So if there's somebody in the room I don't like, for example, if I feel threatened by something, I won't be able to focus on my communication to you right now. I'll be focusing far more importantly on that threat and making sure I stay calm in that threat. So we all have strategies, we all have stimuli, we all have things that we need to skirt around and dance around in life. But it's about getting to know your individual ones. And if you can build your safety zones as much as possible, then you will be mentally more healthy and more aware. By being aware, you can be more healthy, but self-awareness is hugely important in order to achieve that. So what we need a huge amount of self-awareness, constant check-ins. How am I? How am I doing? Why am I feeling nervous? Why am I feeling hot? Why am I feeling sweaty? Why is this happening to me? But we need that linked to openness to learning, because you need to be open to learn new things. So unless you have the link between self-awareness and open to learning, then that self-awareness has nowhere to go. So the magic happens in that overlap. Learning, change and improvement is when self-awareness and openness to learning overlap. And the more we do this, the more we will be able to address our fear zones and turn them into safety zones. But we need to do this every day. It's a bit like having a shower every day for obvious reasons, okay? If you don't have a shower for a while, you know what happens. If you don't eat well for a while, you know what happens. We know the consequences of our self-behaviors, our behaviors towards self, how we treat ourselves. So this is another one. Having a kind approach towards yourself and having strategies that help you is a fundamental part of your self-care regime. And this is so fundamental. Many thanks again to Montegrappa for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here to look at the link between writing and mental health and self-awareness and learning. Learning is my passion. Conscious, intentional learning and becoming intentional learners and leaders of ourselves and others. Please visit our website, investorsinlearning.com. You can contact me there. I love discussing, I love exploring, I love finding solutions for people. I'm there for you to discuss anything further. And thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all the very best.